Welcome to Signum Academy's Time Camp, where we are talking about Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. Here we are. And I'm sorry, people. This continues to be a little bit of a bugaboo for me. So I will do this. I'm trying to get everything squared away so that I see what I'm supposed to see, and I do not block my view. And I have never used this system before. Shows you what happens when you try something new and you haven't tested it yet. I apologize. All right, let's get started. As Sparrow explained yesterday, she would be out today, so I am taking her place very happily. And my name is Sharon Hoff, and I am usually the one taking your questions and your observations and sending them along to Sparrow so that she doesn't have to fiddle with all of this behind the scenes stuff that I'm kind of having a little bit of difficulty with at the moment. Now, today, before we get started, we want to remember our threads. With our looking at the passages that Sparrow has selected for us to go through together. We're going to look at the scientific observation process. We infer from what we have observed, and then we wonder, we pose questions, we think about it. We're going to continue to look for the happy medium in references and ways that Madeline L'Engle will bring that back around and through this next chapter we're looking at. The concept of conforming and also knowing stuff. This chapter perhaps more about feeling, knowing it by feeling or sensing, as opposed to knowing things by the scientific method, by observation. All right, so let's get started. Oh, before we start, I do want to share with you, I do want to thank the group at the, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, the Schohari Library. They sent in some really wonderful pictures of a project they're working on together to make quilts, like Meg's quilt on the very first chapter and the very first day. It made her feel comforted and happy. And so that was really delightful to see. If you would like us to share those pictures, as Sparrow shared that haunted fort, and the kids who are building that, please send us a line at camp@signumu.org to let us know that the people who are in those photos, the children, you have parents' permission to show those photos, and we will share them in the broadcast. We would love to share those, but we do need to be sure that we have your permission to do that for very reasonable safety issues. I just received an email from Ms. Gregory at her camp at the Logan Library in Utah, and her group has shared with us a very interesting proposition. And I would like to go through these with you very quickly. I have a lot of slides to get through, but this is really beautiful, really interesting, and I'd like to share it. I'm using my phone to look at the email. She said, today we talked about how different Chapter 4 would be if Charles Wallace was the one telling the story. Now, we may get ahead of ourselves a little because we haven't covered it yet, but I think it's worth looking at the points that all of her campers have made. Noah said that because Charles Wallace goes first, the timing would be different. Yes, he does Tesser first, doesn't he? He arrives first, so he gets to see everything from the position of having arrived, whereas what do we see? We see it from Meg, who can't quite get there, who has trouble, okay? Emmy said that he would probably use bigger words to make his descriptions because we would be in his mind. So we would be hearing his vocabulary, his word choice. And so, yeah, so the language of it would be quite different. Emmy said that he would probably, then let's see, Kenzie and Adam both talked about how tessering would feel different to Charles Wallace. One, because he understands things. So he understands the process a little better. He maybe knows what to expect. He could guess what to expect a little better. That's possible. And two, because he's smaller. I wonder if size has anything to do with tessering, if it has any effect on tessering. That is a very fascinating thought. Okay, Heber said that Charles Wallace would describe things in more detail. He might. He might. He does observe things he seems to observe things quite intently. So yes, he might describe things in more detail. Ruthie said it might be harder to follow because Charles Wallace already understands things, so he might not take the time to explain it. That's possible. The audience, or the way Charles Wallace thinks, maybe he already knows some information, and we, the reader, might have to guess. That's possible too. Blaine pointed out that Charles Wallace sat the most forward. So we're talking about a little later in the chapter when they're flying up to the mountain. So he wouldn't have been as aware as his other travelers. That's right. We get it from Meg's point of view, and she's in the middle, so she can sense what Charles Wallace's body language is, and she can feel Calvin's arm around her waist, so she can sense what he's doing in the background. You're right. What a great observation. Yeah, that would be different. And Bentley said that Charles Wallace would be more descriptive because he would be feeling less shock. That's possible. I don't know if he would be feeling less shock. Maybe his happy medium is a little more centered. So maybe that's what you're meaning. I think he might have the same sense of awe and wonder, but maybe less of the extreme highs and extreme lows that we sense from Meg. That is possible. That is possible. I wonder, though, if that would make the story as interesting or dramatic or relatable, because I think most of us don't always live in that happy medium. And Meg's extreme reactions, we've all felt them. I think we've all felt them. And that's one of the reasons why we can relate to Meg, or we can appreciate her experience, because I know I've been there. When I was a kid, I loved this book. There were things about Meg that I completely related to, including wearing glasses. These are just reading glasses. I wear contact lenses. My eyesight is so poor, just like Meg. You take them off and everything is a blob, a complete blob. There's no hope. I would be very vulnerable without my corrective lenses or my glasses. So I really related to her, and the kind of emotional ups and downs. Yeah, I was there. All right, so let's thank you so much for that input. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Logan Library Group. Wonderful. Thank you. All right, let's move on. Here we go. I'm going to move things out of the way so I can actually read what I'm looking at. This is not good. There I go again. I clicked out of it and I lost it. Well, folks, to be able to see what I am supposed to read, I'm going to have to do this, and hopefully that will not be unpleasant for you to look at. Okay? Nope, I have to minimize these things. I'm sorry, my friends. I may not be able to see questions very well. I will do my best because I really do need to hit this present button. Oh, gracious. Here we go. Okay. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin, and Mrs. Witch's authoritative voice called out, "Quiet, child." Did a shadow fall across the moon, or did the moon simply go out, extinguished as abruptly and completely as a candle? There was still the sound of leaves, a terrified, terrifying rushing. All light was gone. Darkness was complete. Suddenly the wind was gone and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached for him, her fingers touched nothing. Let's see what Sparrow's questions are. So what do we observe? How do you feel How do you feel about Mrs. Witch shushing Meg? We've got the wild wind again and the darkness. Remember, we saw that at the very beginning of the book, that storm that Meg was in her attic bedroom. How is this like and unlike that hurricane? And do we notice the hand touching, Meg trying to reach out for Calvin? Go ahead and type in your responses of any of the answers to these, and we'll get to them. We'll go through them. Okay? What do we observe? Bella suggests that Mrs. Witch is the boss. Yes, there's that sense of authority. There is that sense that she's in control here. Right. Miss Gregory, Natalie says we are starting a new part of the story, so it mirrors what we see at the beginning. You're right. That's a great observation. This is almost like starting over, going back to where we were with the storm and something unknown happening, and Meg being very scared. Very true. Very good. Okay. We see a lot of darkness here. And I know, since most of you have read the chapter, darkness, be thinking about darkness and whether it's truly the same as what we see later or if darkness means something else. Okay? And again, we've got the touching, Meg reaching out to feel Calvin. Meg is the kind of person that needs to touch people to feel comforted, to feel secure. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a weakness. Some people might think it is. Some people who read the book, who are sensitive to people touching them, don't like it. They might kind of question that and say, why is that a big deal? But for some people, touch is incredibly important for them to feel secure, to know where they are in place, in time, in space. Even just sitting in your chair, feeling it firmly so you're not tipping out of it with your feet planted. Some people, touch is very important. I think that is the case for Meg. And Bella says, I think tessering is scary. Well, we can certainly see that this whole experience for Meg is scary, but let's see what it might be for other people. All right, she was completely alone. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere either to save or to turn to. She was alone in a fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporeal Meg simply was not. And corporeal comes from the root word that we get the word corpse from. It means body. So her body, the sense of the person, the physical person of Meg, simply was not. Bella says, I can't see the next slide. Is anybody else having trouble seeing the slide that I just read from? Please let me know if that is the case. I'm sorry, Jubilee, can you see it? Yes? Or are you having trouble? Sorry, a yes-no answer. I didn't really pose a yes-no question. Can you see the slide? Let's see if other people answer for me. I will wait because I don't want to go on if people cannot see. Let's see, no responses just yet. So I think I will go on because I don't want to waste time. All right, look at this moment. She has lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Up here, I cannot see the slide. We still see Mrs. Witch. Oh, gracious. Let's see what I can do. So let's see. You know what, folks? we're going to whoops. Whoops. We're going to leave that mode. We are back to this mode. And we're going to pop this up. And we're just going to do what we can do. All right. I'll have to show what it shows. There we go. We're just going to wiggle it around. I apologize, but at least you can see it, and that's what's important, in my opinion. Wonderful. Now we can see this slide. That's good. Thank you. All right, I apologize. All right, so we have lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Not only that, what else has she lost? I'm going to wait and see if you can tell me what she's lost besides the protection of Calvin's hand. And it does have to do with a sense of touch. What else has she lost the sense of? Yes, Jubilee, she has lost herself. Remember, I was just talking about how some people, when they sit in a chair, they really need to sit in a chair and feel their feet on the ground and know where they are in space. She's lost that. Can you imagine that? That has got to be one of the most difficult things to imagine, because really, we're feeling stuff all the time. Some people may have lost their sense of hearing. They may be deaf, or perhaps their sense of sight. They may not be able to see. And those senses, we commonly, there are people who live very productive lives and they work around those things. But a sense of touch? I wonder if that's even possible, to lose a sense of touch and not know where you are. What would that make you feel? The word that I would be coming up with is the word disorienting. When you're oriented, you know where you are in space. And when you're disoriented, you're lost. Bella says herself, she's lost herself. She probably thinks she's lost her mind. That could be very true indeed. All right, let's move on. Oops, skipping around. Here we go. This movement, she felt, must be the turning of the earth, rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course about the sun. And this feeling of moving with the earth was somewhat like the feeling of being in an ocean, out in the ocean beyond this rising and falling of the breakers, lying on the moving water, pulsing gently with the swells and feeling the gentle, inexorable tug of the moon. Okay, we've got some description there. Sparrow has noted here, look at all those movement sensations. We don't have a lot of words for movement senses, but wow, Madeline L'Engle really describes that well. Can you imagine these sensations as we read these words? How does she make those feel, those sensations? So this is as feeling and sensation is returning to Meg in this whole tessering process. Now, mind you, we know she's tessering. She has no idea what is going on. None whatsoever. Mrs. Witch just swooped them away in this storm. So now her senses are returning and she's feeling this movement. You still can't see the slide I'm reading. Oh, good gracious. Let me see. I am sharing the correct screen. Got it. Okay. All right. Yes, Bella, I will do my best. And you know what I'm going to do? When I think I have next shared the next screen. I will wait to make sure that people confirm that they see the next screen before I start reading. It just took a minute. Okay. Thank you, Natalie. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. So back to the slide. We've got some words maybe we want to cover. Do we know what inexorable means? Inexorable? Inexorable means it's unresistible, irresistible. It's going to happen. It's there's no way of exiting, exorable, of getting away from this tug of the moon, because you know that the movement and the tides are affected on Earth by the moon, the gravity pull of the moon. And then the idea that if you're not familiar with the seaside, with how the ocean works when it hits the coast, the breakers that are mentioned here, the rising and falling of the breakers, that's where the waves are crashing in. And that motion is a lot more chaotic and powerful, and the waves get bigger when you get close to land. But what she is talking about, what Madeline L'Engle is describing, is when you're farther out to sea and you just have the swells, because the water is moving in these rolling motions of waves underneath, and it causes these sort of gradual bumps. Now in a big storm, even out to sea, they're big. But right here, the description is these undulating swells. Okay. Any comments? This is a wonderfully descriptive section here. All right. Let's keep moving. Now I'm going to advance the slide. Let's see if it catches up. And I am on the next slide. Does anyone see the next slide? Did you see it change? No, Bella says. All right. No, Jubilee says. Interesting. How about now? There you go. I think I know what I'm going to have to do every time, and that's fine. I will do it. Okay. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there. Oh, this is Meg watching from her perspective. Now remember, she hasn't come through yet. She's still watching from this in-between state. All right, let's see what she says. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there and then that he was. It wasn't that part of him came first and then the rest of him followed, like a hand and then an arm, an eye, and then a nose. It wasn't that. It was a sort of shimmering, a looking at Calvin through water, through smoke, through fire, and then there he was, solid and reassuring. But suddenly, Meg felt a violent push and a shattering, as though she had been thrust through a wall of glass. Wow. Okay. Sparrow's note says she just described something that no human has ever actually seen or felt in a way that we can all understand. Wow, that's true. What do you see between these two experiences? Calvin's experience of coming through in a shimmering and just appearing solid and reassuring, and then Meg's experience. Do you think they're the same? Do you think Charles, we already read, we had read about Charles Wallace coming through. We see a description of Calvin coming through, and he immediately says, "Where's Meg? What's going on?" Does it look like his reaction was that he had felt a violent push and a shattering like Meg did? What do you see there? What are is there any similarities, any differences between their experience? I'm going to give you just a minute to suggest what your observation is. So I know what I see, but I want to know what you see. Let's see. So yeah, so maybe we have two different experiences. Clearly, Calvin seemed a lot more calm, relaxed. Let's see, not as violent. Natalie suggests that this ties in later when they can see through Mrs. Witch. So Natalie, are you suggesting that maybe Mrs. Witch remains in this sort of other space? She doesn't fully materialize through the tester? That could be. That could be. Jenny says, Meg seems to fight and resist things. And I wonder if that quality in her also made testering more difficult and dramatic for her. That is something that I have been thinking, Jenny. I think that that is something that we can infer. Remember, that's part of the scientific process. We observe, then we infer, and then we wonder. I wonder if that is what that means. I think that this is a sign of maybe someone who does not have that happy medium, whose experience of everything is an extreme high or an extreme low. And this may be an issue of this. Maybe the secret to tessering is to go with the flow. So we've talked about how conforming or finding that happy medium is a benefit. We've talked about, the pros and the cons. I think this definitely would be a benefit, because if I were going to be testering, I would not want to have Meg's experience every time. I'd rather have the Charles Wallace experience or even the Calvin experience, right? Jenny says, Calvin goes with the flow and Charles seems to always be able to figure out what's going on. Interesting. So maybe Calvin's experience of the happy medium is that sort of go with the flow, just go along. Maybe he doesn't always understand. Maybe the reason Charles Wallace, it's easier for him to achieve a happy medium is because he does understand so much more. I wonder if Meg understood things at the level of Charles Wallace. I wonder if she would fight experiences as much as she does. She might not fight as much if she knew, if she was aware. But she always seems in such a muddle and not knowing things. Maybe that's one of her sources of her extremes. And so Jenny says, so maybe that makes it easier for them to test her. Right, Calvin and Charles. That's true. That's possible. All right, let's move on. I think I've got it. Here we go. I will do that. And I will do that. And you should see the next slide. Okay, wonderful. And now we have Meg's reaction. She, Meg, pushes her glasses up on her nose to reassure herself that what she was seeing is real. Sparrow made her note. She just likes that image. The pushing up. Did I see? I've done that too. We're going to see more of Meg's glasses and Mrs. Who's later in the book. We are. Oh, Bella can't see it. Good grief. Anyone else? I thought I had it down. Let's try the next slide. Okay. How about this, my friends? Right, it just does take a minute. Thank you, Natalie. So give it a second for it to populate, to pop up the next slide, and we'll be good. Thank you. So I think my system does work. Okay. Terrific. Thanks for everybody responding. Okay, now we get a description of the planet Uriel. There are, as Sparrow says here in her note, there are gorgeous, colorful descriptions of the planet Uriel. When you read it, what colors are there? Or sorry, when you read it, past tense, what did your imagination put into your own personal mind movie? Now, I know many of us have seen the recent film that came out. And I believe there were other versions of it that came out, like perhaps it's a TV movie. It's really, really difficult if you have seen the movie first before you read a book to create your own mind movie, your own images in your head that haven't been affected by those. So I appreciate if that sort of has blended for you if you came to the book after seeing the movie. But if you came to it before, go ahead and share with me. Tell me, what was something that you found the most intriguing or the most beautiful or the most interesting about this description of Uriel, the planet? Go ahead and fill that in. Send in your comments and I will read the rest of Sparrow's slide here. She says, I'll bet some of you know that Uriel is also the name of one of the archangels in scripture writings. And this is in the Jewish and in the Christian faith traditions. There are scriptural writings, not necessarily in the collected Bible or other works, but in other stories that have been written. And a very interesting thing, Sparrow notes, Uriel the archangel, one of the things he's known for is his very accurate sight and even discernment. And is also associated with light. So she says, hold that in your head for a few minutes, and then you can tell us in the next coming slides as we experience what happens on Uriel, how that might connect to the planet and what's going on there. Let's see, Emmy was seeing a luscious green. Kinsey saw bright yellows, reds, oranges, purples, just a rainbow. Yes, we get the sense of abundance of color, right? Not a stingy little pop of color, maybe here and there in a drab background, but just about everything is exploding with color, right? I agree. I see that too. Great observations. Okay. We're doing great. Let's keep going on our slides. Go ahead and type in anything else you might want to. I can go back to it to cover it again. All right, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to go ahead and do my little click through just to make sure it's sharing properly. Okay, give it a minute to populate. It'll pop up and Jenny M says, it reminded me of some of the photos and descriptions I've seen of Bhutan, okay, with soaring mountains and a bowl of verdant valley. Verdant means very lush green. And yes, lush with life and light, absolutely. Verdant, we get that word from the word verde, which means green. That's a color word. But it also has that plant, it's got a plant connotation. Very nice, very nice. So I guess, Jenny, possibly you have seen the photos and heard the descriptions of this area. I've never been there. But maybe you and your groups can use the internet to research and find this place, Bhutan. It's spelled B-H-U-T-A-N. B-H-U-T-A-N. You can Google that and see if Jenny's description or her thoughts match yours. That would be a great little project for someone in your groups to do. Okay, here we are. Let's go on to the next one. If you ladies have had your fun, I think you should tell Calvin and Meg a little more all about this, Charles Wallace said coldly. You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her off this way without any warning. Fixerunt animi raro et Per pauca loquentis, Mrs. Who intoned. Horace, to action little, less to words inclined. Mrs. Who, I wish you'd stop quoting. Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Whatsit adjusted her stole. But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out words on her own. Wow. Remember when we asked before why we thought Mrs. Who used quotes? Different people came up with different ideas. Maybe she knew so much that this was a better way of expressing herself. She was a part of all time, so she had all of these quotes at her disposal to share. She had deep thoughts, that kind of thing. But Mrs. Whatsit here tells us it's actually because it's difficult for her to come up with her own set of words to describe what's going on, what to say, what she's thinking. So she borrows from other people who have said it perhaps better than she thinks she could say it herself. And that's why she's quoting. Fascinating. Can you imagine having all that kind of memory to be able to exactly quote people, to have read so much that you have all of those quotes and sayings and clever short ideas said so well that you could just spew them back like Mrs. Who. That would be pretty cool. But on the other hand, I don't know, would you want to be able to do that, or would you like to be able to say your own thoughts in your own words? As Mrs. Whatsit says, she finds it difficult to verbalize. Okay, but I have one idea. What can you infer from this, or what can you get? These creatures, these beings, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Which, are clearly not human. They know about humans. And we've gotten the idea that when they materialize, they dress up, they look funny. But here, Mrs. Who is struggling to verbalize. Do they have trouble communicating with Charles Wallace? Because remember how Charles Wallace senses things in a different way? And he seems to know what is going on. So maybe verbalizing, using words, maybe that's not their first best way of communicating. These creatures maybe have a different way of communicating. And verbalizing the way we humans do is kind of not natural for them. So that gives us more of a picture of what these beings are like, what Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, and Mrs. Which are like. I find that fascinating. All right, let's move on. Okay, here we are. All right, this is funny. Yes, thank you, Natalie. I like with their wings. Their wings, yes, that's part of how they verbalize and communicate. We'll see that in a minute, this description that we get of these creatures. Exactly. All right, let's see. I want to make sure you can see this. And it's updated. All right. So to this point, we haven't seen Mrs. Which yet. We've just heard her voice. Meg has not seen her yet. And what does she do? When she comes through, what does she look like? What does Mrs. Which look like? I would like you to respond with your memory of her description of what Mrs. Which looks like and why Mrs. Which appears the way she does. I'm going to give you a minute. Please enter in your thoughts. And yes, she is being funny. You're right, Mrs. Which is being funny. What is her description in the book? Let's see. Yes, Jenny mentions that she is Mrs. Witch is looking like a stereotypical witch, like a what we kind of draw at Halloween, right? With the pointed hat, the long gray hair, the big crooked nose, her black gown, and her claw-like hand on the broomstick. Kenzie says she looks like a witch. Right, who hides in the shadows? Yes, one we typically see. Right, black robe, black hat, glasses. Bella, Bella has a question which we will get to in just a minute. Just a minute. So she's making a joke because don't all of the Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who, they kind of choose how they kind of look. We're getting the sense that they get to choose how they look, how they appear to the children. And Mrs. Witch has made a joke. She's made a pun, right? A play on words. Exactly. So here she is. So now Mrs. Witch has made a statement. And here's what Sparrow wants us to look at. For some reason, Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. What did she do? What did Meg just experience? Something from our threads. She's not previously been comfortable or able to do what? What? What has she not been able to do? Yes. Okay, we're back to the Mrs. Witch as being a homonym. Yes, that's what a pun is. And going back to the description of Mrs. Witch, Jenny says she wonders if part of this is to further the image of that haunted house, remember, as well as her own sense of fun. I love that these three have such a sense of humor in spite of their serious work. Yes. The lightness, and isn't there a comment that having fun, Charles Wallace, I think, kind of criticizes them for fooling around a little bit too much, and I think Mrs. Who has some quote about this is dangerous stuff and we need to lighten our hearts. We need to cheer ourselves up so we can face what's ahead, right? Exactly. Okay, but let's go back to this, to Meg. What did she just do in this little moment, this little tiny snippet that Sparrow wants us to look at? That in spite of how Mrs. Witch looks, she looks like a witch, and usually we think witches are scary. And her ephemeral means not corporeal. There we go, an opposite term. It's not actually firm because she's still shimmery and not quite in. You can kind of see through her, and she's still got her broomstick. In spite of how she appears, what is Meg able to do that she wasn't able to do before? And I'll let you think about that because it's important. It's part of something that we like to see in really satisfying books and stories and literature. Let's use the word literature. We like to see that characters change. They develop. Something about them just doesn't stay the same. Some things about a character are going to change based on their experience. And that's what, in fancy terms, technical literature, classroom terms, we call character development. How does the character develop? That's a question here. It's important to note. All right. Meg is displaying emotional intelligence. She's developing a better sense about people and how to look beneath the surface. Thank you, Jenny. That's a great observation. It's true. It says it right here. Meg felt that Mrs. Witch. Remember, Meg is very scientific. She sees things that she can believe. Her senses are what she counts on. But in this case, she's feeling it. She feels that in spite of what her sense of sight and observation tells her about the visual representation of Mrs. Witch, she can trust her. She's getting a feeling. And it seems like she's good with that. She's now starting to trust her own inference, her own experience, her own knowledge of people that we know that Calvin already has, and Charles Wallace has this deeper sense. So we're seeing this develop. It's wonderful. It's a tiny little thing. It's only what? One sentence, but it's powerful. This one sentence is very powerful. Okay, let's go on. I will hit my button just to be on the safe side to make sure it goes forward. Okay, remember, they have had the explanation that they're all have come to this planet Uriel to stop and catch their breaths and to prepare for what is to come. Okay, but what can Meg think about? What is all she thinks about? Let's read. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We can't, not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. Vitam impendere vero. To stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do. That is what your father is doing, Mrs. Whatsit nodded. Okay, so Sparrow wants us to pause and think about where Meg's emotions have been so far in this part of the story. Happy medium? Not quite yet. Her emotions have been quite vulnerable, I think. What do you think? What do you think this shows? How have they been so far in this part of the story, perhaps this chapter? Has Meg been up, down, sideways, mellow, not anything going on? What do we see? Yes, yes. I mean, first she had this earth-shattering experience of being tessered out of nowhere suddenly, struggling against that, fighting against that, being probably fearful, right? Thank you, fearful about the whole experience, not being able to trust her senses. She can't feel people. And now, what is her first thought? They'd been talking about, Charles Wallace had set them up and said, I think this adventure will be finding our father, and her father would be the important thing. And that's where, yes, that's where her sense of security is with her father, and she wants to get her security back. Okay, and Kenzie says she freaks out too much, but her drama is what makes her story interesting. The story interesting. You're right. Very great observation, Kenzie. That's kind of what we maybe saw in the information that you shared with us about thinking if this was told from Charles Wallace's perspective, maybe we wouldn't get this kind of feeling and this kind of intense storytelling if we didn't have Meg's senses of feelings. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so she is still impatient. She still has this sense of urgency. Her number one priority. This girl has had some amazing experiences. She's on a different planet. She's seeing this landscape around her that's somewhat like her own, but clearly very different. But what is the first thing on her mind? It's still finding her father. She's not gonna be distracted, right? So maybe this is one of those times when that happy medium, go with the flow, kind of see what everything's happening, If you're to go with the flow, you may never get to a goal. But she's very goal oriented, and she has not forgotten that they are there. They are on this journey to find her father. Let's see. Any more comments before we move on? All right, let's see. Okay. Ah, the exciting business. I will pop that just to make sure. Very good. Okay. Write in anything you think about this. Okay. This is when Mrs. Whatsit is changing. Shall I, dear? Yes, do. Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted, whitened. The pudding bag shape stretched, lengthened, merged, and suddenly before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had ever imagined. And the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. Whatsit was surely no longer a Mrs. Whatsit. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse, for from the magnificently modeled back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, but a man with perfection of dignity and virtue, an exaltation of joy such as Meg had never before seen. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. And from the shoulders, slowly, a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon water, of poetry. Calvin fell to his knees. Whoa, what an amazing description. What an amazing description. I know that Madeline L'Engle was trying to give us the sense of almost indescribable beauty and just a sense of otherness about this creature that Mrs. Whatsit turned into. Did she do a good job? Did she achieve that for you? Let's see. Hang on, Bella. Hang on. We're going to go through our text methodically. Okay, Bella, you do get ahead for us, don't you? All right, let's see. You've got this image in your head. This is what I would like you to do. Keep this image in your head. And Bella, I'm going to note your question and I will look at it more closely a little later, and I will have Sparrow address it perhaps tomorrow, okay? So you've got this image in your head. And one thing that some people are very inspired to do is to make visual representations of what they see in their head. And sometimes it's really challenging. And when books are created of texts, of stories, the people over in the marketing department at the publisher says, we need an amazing cover for this book, something that will make the book leap off the shelf and say, buy me. This creature thing, this Mrs. Whatsit thing, that is perfect. Go ahead and they get an artist and they say, read this description and draw this for us, paint this for us, so we can put it on the book cover. Is it really successful? Something like that? Noah says this was a big indicator that this is fantasy. You are right, Noah. This is fantasy because it's not even something, it's not a Greek centaur. It specifically says this is not a Greek centaur, but it's got a horse body with a human looking thing. And isn't that a centaur? Madeline L'Engle doesn't want us to think it's a centaur. Something as mundane and normal as a centaur, right? But let's look at this next slide. And this slide Sparrow has given us shows us the different book covers that artists have come up with because they've been told by the publishing companies, make a picture with that creature on the front. Well, look at them. They all sort of pick up on some different things, don't they? This first one on the left has what definitely looks like a centaur with some sort of rainbowy wings. The middle one really emphasizes those wings, but they're kind of thick and white and, well, okay, if that's what the artist thinks, I'm not going to argue with them. And this last one over here on the right really emphasizes that rainbow arcing effect coming out from the back, but it's a rainbow as in just that line, that set line. I'll have to be honest with you, I kind of have something completely different in my mind. But you know, it's really hard, it's really difficult as an artist to put into a unmoving, static, that means not moving, not changing image, something that seems so alive and so vibrant. Jubilee loves that description that we just read, yes. And Jennifer M. says, the description of Mrs. Whatsit's transformation is beautiful, and this being is transcendent. It makes me think of how different someone's real self may be from who we think they are and what they look like before we know them well. Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. That's amazing. So true. So true, because the description we're given of these creatures gives us action, motion, a sense of the impression that the viewers, Meg and Charles Wallace and Calvin, the feeling they get coming off of this creature, the virtue, the nobility, the purity, all of these things. You can't get that sometimes just by that first impression of people. Do we kind of hide some of our features? The sense of who we are, maybe our sense of personality, our sense of humor, the things we're interested in, the way we treat other people. Sometimes you can't get that from a first impression. Very good, Jenny. Thank you. It is a good reminder to look deeper when you meet people and you get to know people. Bella does say she loves centaurs. They're so cool. But remember, these are not centaurs. And Bella has a very reasonable question about how you fly with the rainbow wings. You'd have to imagine maybe they come forward and out. Is there sense of, you know, we think of flying like birds. They have actual physical wings that push. I wonder, are these wings energy wings? Are they made of physical form, or are they light and energy? The description says that they're light, so maybe they're not quite as physical. Maybe it passes through the children. Maybe they're more forward and the children are a little further back and they don't bump in. That is something to think about. That is something to think about. All right, we're going to move on because it is almost time to be done, but I did get started a little later, so I'm going to keep going a little more quickly. Sorry about that, folks, but it will be fine. Okay. No, Mrs. Whatsit said, though her voice was not Mrs. Whatsit's voice. Not to me, Calvin, never to me. Stand up. Remember, Calvin had bowed to her because it was so awesome. And she said, do not to me. Sparrow says, this is such a simple thing to say, but oh, there's so much inside those words. What can we read between those lines, or feel, or observe, or infer, or wonder? I know the one thing that comes to my mind, and since we have to go a little faster, I'm going to have less time to take your comments and wait for your comments. And I'm going to say the one thing that pops into my mind is that in spite of how amazing and awesome and wonderful this creature is, there's a sense of humility. This creature does not want to be bowed to, does not maybe want to have power over others. There's a sense of humility. Okay? So you think on that. And again, any comments or observations, you can send them along a little later. Here we go. And now, remember, they see all the creatures swimming and playing and laying on the grass and dancing above the trees, flying. And this is the song that they sing, and Sparrow wanted us to share this. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. Ye that go down to the sea and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof, let the wilderness and the cities thereof lift their voice. Let the inhabitants of the rock sing. Let them shout from the top of the mountain. Let them give glory unto the Lord. So all of these creatures and all of these beings are singing this song, and this is the only way that Charles Wallace, remember, these are the words, like Mrs. Who, he is quoting something else that gives the impression of what those centaurs are singing, because, not centaurs, those beings are singing, because this is the only way he can express it. And this is something that Charles Wallace knows. And it's a piece of scripture from what is known as, in Christian faith, the Old Testament. For the Jewish people, it is sacred holy scriptures from the book of Isaiah. And it is a praise, it is a song of praise to a higher being. Sparrow wants you to think about how this passage made you feel. And for her, for Sparrow, she says this beautiful quotation is something that she copied down when she was your age and carried with her for years and years. And she suggests that you think about doing that for yourself with words that really touch you. You can find things that touch you, that give you that uplifted feeling. These creatures are not down in the dumps, right? They're experiencing this sort of glory, this amazing experience. And this, I think, ties in too with why Mrs. Whatsit did not want Calvin to bow to her, because these creatures seem to have a sense of praising something that's greater than themselves. And they include everything, all of the earth, the wilderness, the rocks, the people in the cities, everything. So they are including themselves with what should be praising something else, not be praised themselves, that sense of humility. Okay, here we go. Stay with me just a couple more minutes, my friends. Okay, and in response to this, throughout her entire body, Meg felt a pulse of joy such as she had never known before. Calvin's hand reached out. He did not clasp her hand in his. He moved his fingers so that they were barely touching hers, but joy flowed through them, back and forth between them, around them, and about them, and inside them. Wow. Again, I ran out of time. I'm so sorry. Please share your observations and emails, but I will tell you something that I see here. Before, Meg needed that touch for reassurance, but she doesn't need reassurance here. Now that touch is not so much that she's taking reassurance from someone else, but she's participating in the sharing of this joy, of this experience. She still needs to touch someone to show that she's experiencing it together, but she doesn't need reassurance. The touch is because we're doing this together. We're experiencing this together. You see this, right? You're feeling what I'm feeling, right? And that joy is flowing between them. That is amazing. Amazing. But as we know, that can't last for long in this time. And that's the whole point of this chapter, which is why I really needed to keep going. Here we are. They're on the top of the mountain. They've been forced to look away from the moon, which is a source of reflected light from the sun, and they turn around. It was a shadow, nothing but a shadow. It was not even as tangible as a cloud. Was it cast by something, or was it a thing in itself? The dark shadow was still there. It had not lessened or dispersed with the coming of night, and where the shadow was, the stars were not visible. What could there be about a shadow that was so terrible that she knew that there had never been before, nor ever would be again, anything that would chill her with a fear that was beyond shuddering, beyond crying or screaming, beyond the possibility of comfort? The shadow was still there, dark and dreadful. Calvin held her hand strongly in his, but she felt neither strength or reassurance in his touch. Calvin turned, rejecting the dark thing that blotted out the light of the stars. "Make it go away, Mrs. Whatsit," he whispered. "Make it go away. It's evil." Here is our foe. Bella asked yesterday why this was part of the story, why this thing was here. We know that when characters in a book or in a story face challenges, they call it conflict. And sometimes challenges are manufactured to be in a story to simply be a reason for characters to achieve something, to grow, to get over something. But I'm wondering, because Calvin names it as evil, maybe it also is the whole point of the story. We want to go through this experience with Meg. We want to have this fantastic adventure, but maybe facing and talking about and thinking about this shadow, maybe that's the whole point of this story. I don't know. It's difficult to ask, why did an author do this? Because unless an author writes it down and says, I put this and such in the story because I wanted to do this. Or an interviewer asks them, why did you put this in your story? And they explain it exactly. Usually that doesn't happen. And so when we read a story, we can't always really confidently know exactly why an author did what they did. What we can do is think, what does this do to the story? How does this affect the story? What can I see, observe, infer, and wonder about this thing that this happened in a story, or this character that's in a story? So we have to be careful when we ask, why is something in a story? But I can see that putting this shadow, this thing, into the story has changed everything. It's gotten much bigger than just Meg being uncomfortable in her own skin, or even just Meg trying to find her father. Suddenly, on this planet, looking out into space, this challenge has become as big as the universe. It's not small anymore. It's not just Meg. It's not just her father. It's much bigger. Okay. Almost there to the last one. And her final words in the chapter are, that dark thing we saw, she said, is that what my father is fighting? And suddenly, again, it's gotten bigger. Again, Sparrow asked, how does Meg know that? Is she developing her sense of knowing? She's putting two and two together. They came to Uriel for different reasons, for a breather, something about her father. They didn't give her answers. They said, we got to show you instead. They had all this beautiful experience, and now the absolute opposite. They saw the shadow, the thing, and she's put it together. Is that what my father is fighting? And we'll leave you till tomorrow. Please read your chapters, enjoy your activities, and we'll have Sparrow back tomorrow, and she will take us on a much more timely adventure through the next chapter. Thank you guys for bearing with my technical difficulties, and we will see you then. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.